Hi, everyone, and welcome to LunART Live. My name is Marie Pauls, and I'm the Educational Director for LunART. Today, we have a fascinating topic, which is on Western art, music, and racialization. And we're really excited to have ethnomusicologist Nadia Chana from UW-Madison Mead-Witter School of Music with us. Welcome, Nadia. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So ethnomusicology is a field that not everybody might be familiar with. So I was hoping that before we get started, you could just give us a little quick nutshell definition of what is ethnomusicology.
Sure. So the really short definition is it's the study of music and culture, or music and people. And so what that means is focusing on what music means in people's lives, how people use music for various purposes, rather than, say, a focus on musical text or something like that. Traditionally, ethnomusicology has been the study of non-Western music, although now it applies to both Western and non-Western music. And it's more to do with the method, asking how people feel about the music they make, how it operates in their lives.
So I had the wonderful privilege to do a collaboration with Madison Youth Choir and Madison Choral Project, and that's how I got to know Nadia. And so I'm really happy to have her here. And so Nadia, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your approach to this mini lecture. Where are you now? Tell us a little more.
Yeah, so I am, my approach, we were talking about this a little while before, and I say at the beginning of the longer lecture that I'm going to leave a lot of space and speak really slowly so that you can really feel how my words land in your body. And I might not be doing that right now on the Q&A, but I think that that's really important when we're approaching topics of race, racialization, these topics that have a lot of pain attached to them, really for everybody, but in different ways. So I think really honoring what our bodily responses are is really, really important, not just for people of color, but also for white folks. I am on Ho-Chunk territory right now, in a place called Dejope, also known as Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm looking at Lake Monona right now.
Yeah, that's it's important for us to have this sort of broader historical perspective. And obviously this topic is so deep and multifaceted. We're going to be lucky if we even scratch a little bit of the surface. So, but I know that your lecture is going to give us a lot of ideas to think about and get us to keep asking questions. We're going to start with some ways in which musical organizations deal with race issues. So let's dive into the lecture.
On one hand, I see a lot of people talking about Black composers, like let's program Black composers. That will solve a lot of the problems. I love this idea in many ways because I think that we should be moving away from, the tried and true sort of great white male composers, not because that they're bad, but they are very much fetishized. The way that I learned music history was sort of one story about one great white man after another. And these are not just European composers, but European composers specifically from Western Europe, from France and Germany and Austria, and occasionally England and occasionally Russia, right? So what does it mean to look beyond those people? And what does it mean to look beyond those people's descendants? So I love that idea. On the other hand, what if we back up and look at what it takes to become a composer? And it's here that I would love to turn to the work of the brilliant scholar Naomi Andre, who in her book called Black Opera writes, she's writing about the role of Otello in an opera by Verdi called Otello. And this is a Black character. She writes, quote, "As I write this in 2017, such a goal," and she's talking here about the goal of singing the role of Otello, "is not possible for the young children in Flint, Michigan, whose water supply has been contaminated over the past few years with lead and other toxic chemicals through the irresponsible decisions about infrastructure made by a white-dominated state government to save money. Flint, with its poor, predominantly Black population, could have been home to a child's voice with the potential to develop into an Otello, and yet we will probably never know," end quote. If you're struggling to pay rent, if you're set back economically, and if composition or Western classical voice, if those arts require lessons that are expensive, of course, there are going to be fewer Black composers, fewer Black singers. And so while it does a good thing to say, like, let's include Black composers, we also need to look at, why there are not as many Black composers. And what are we going to do about it? And in this case, when I say we, I'm saying those of us who are economically privileged right now. What are we going to do about it? Another strategy that I've seen is to say, okay, we don't have enough people of color. Let's get more people of color into our choirs, into our orchestras. This paints the problem as something that looks like, there's not enough of this color, we need more. And I really, really would love also this action. Here's my wish. So if you have like a white choir or a white congregation or a white orchestra, instead of immediately going out and trying to find people of color to put into those structures, what would it mean to ask, why are there no people of color here right now? Or even to say, what about this environment might be uncomfortable for people of color? And how can we change that environment? And I hope that this is maybe something that might feel really uncomfortable, I can imagine, especially as a white person, to really consider that, to take a long look at oneself and one's organization and say, what about me or my organization makes it so that people of color don't want to be there? That's hard to look at. But I encourage that look. And there can be something, I think, empowering about that too, because then you don't need people of color to come in to fix the problem. You can start working on what you have diagnosed as a problem and start working on it from the inside.
Wow, thank you, Nadia, so much for offering this perspective. The idea of programming Black composers has been a huge thing as of recent. And what you're talking about, automatically brings to mind for me these issues of privilege and equity, socioeconomic issues, who has access to music education. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what are some ways that certain musical environments might be uncomfortable for people of color?
Yeah, there's a lot there in that question. And there's so much, there's a lot there. And just to, in that example specifically, when I'm talking about Black composers, obviously, like when Naomi Andre is talking about, what are the possibilities of a young singer growing up in Flint, Michigan, becoming a singer who can sing Otello. Like there is to some extent some generalization, right? And right now we're talking about specifically about the racialization and the histories of Blackness in the States. So let's say like once people of color of all different backgrounds are in a place, like what might make them feel uncomfortable will often be really different things. You know, like I can speak for myself and say that, you know, if people are assuming, you know, like making jokes about, you know, their grandparents or parents listening to a certain type of music, you know, my grandparents don't speak English or didn't, you know, for example. So that might be just sort of assumed shared understanding. But something like that's been on my mind lately, I mean, if we're thinking about the current uprisings and most recently Jacob Blake, a Black man being shot 7 times in the back by police in Kenosha, like right here in Wisconsin. I mean, I could imagine, here's a hypothetical situation. Let's say there was something like an orchestra rehearsal, which there wouldn't be due to COVID. But, you know, let's say it was a primarily white or primarily non-Black orchestra of people who were maybe not paying so much attention to that. And I could imagine that, like, coming into that space as a Black person who likely knows people who have been, um, if not murdered, then perhaps harmed by the police. If they themselves are people who wake up and kind of think, you know, am I gonna make it to being an old person? I could see it being really alienating to come into a space where people are like, you know, joking about a cool type of beer that they got. Just the different worlds is so jarring. So those are 2 specific examples. But I think this assumed like shared experience that edges out other people is I think what I'm talking about sometimes when I'm saying like what makes it uncomfortable for people of color to be there. Um, or just not being sort of even considered for opportunities or leadership roles. Like I can think if a say a voice teacher is used to thinking about Western classical singers looking like Renee Fleming or Joyce DiDonato, or maybe even Leontine Price, who's a Black singer. The other 2 are white. If that's the kind of archetype they have in their mind, then they might be more likely to choose like children for solos that kind of fit that archetype. And if there's somebody who's, say, like Southeast Asian or South Asian, and there isn't a good archetype for them to plug into, those people might just not be even legible as possibilities. So there are a few really different examples, but there's a lot to talk about there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the other thing that I love how you bring up is taking responsibility for the situation as a musical organization. So looking beyond just programming Black composers and just kind of looking at the roots of the system, like what are the societal issues that are cause us to be in this situation where we have fewer people of color as performing as musicians in classical groups and fewer composers that are represented just in the general programming.
Yeah, and I love the idea. I know that in Western classical music, often we're sort of like looking within musical communities to ask, how can we change? But I'm also really curious about what happens if we as communities engaged with things that were already going on in our communities. Like, what if we found Black-led organizations in Wisconsin, say like well, here in Madison, Freedom Inc. or Urban Triage, and really kind of as a community followed what they were doing and asked ourselves, well, how does this apply to us? Or what do we take from here? Instead of always coming from the inside of music organizations, which are generally Western classical music organizations, which are generally like maybe not as diverse as some of these organizations or don't have the leadership of people of color. So that's something that I'm really curious about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we'll do now is dive in a little bit more to some specific examples that you're going to share of situations that happened to you personally.
Okay, so I'm going to transition now. So some of you might have been wondering, okay, but like what makes it uncomfortable for people of color to be somewhere? I'm going to give you an example, but it really is about sort of the diagnosis of like the subtle things that might happen. And so I would love for you to take this in with like, when have I done this? Or, I certainly have committed acts of racism, and I am working on this myself. So I gave a talk at a choral conference in my home province, which is Alberta, Canada. And a Black woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, I am so excited to hear you talk about this. I grew up here in Edmonton, and I always find being at these conferences so awkward because nobody talks to me." And in that moment, I felt, oh my goodness, I had always sort of blamed my social skills, like, oh, maybe I'm awkward, or blamed Albertan culture, like even though I grew up in it. Oh, Albertans are really standoffish. They don't want to talk to me. And this musician really helped me see that, like, actually, I just wasn't somebody that people were interested in talking to. And this was really palpable after my talk because I gave the talk. People wanted to talk to me about the talk. So we left the room because another talk was going to happen. And I had like a little crowd of people that I was talking with. And then a singer who had not been at my talk, but who had been on the program. I went to her recital that was like a little bit before that, came up to us, and it was very subtle, but it was hard to tell that the group of people had assembled because they had been talking about my paper. And she just kind of barely looked at me and like angled her body so that she was in the circle, and she literally pushed me out of it. And it is those moments that I think I would hope that we reflect on, because I'm really curious, not about, oh, let's make everything inclusive, but I am really interested in what is going on when people are making those judgment calls, when people are making those judgment calls about who is important, who is worth talking to, who is authoritative, etc. And I think that is some of the sort of more day-to-day questions that we could ask ourselves, all of us. I'm including people of color as well.
Okay, thank you again, Nadia. Wow, this just brings to my mind so many different things like self-awareness, empathy, how we can blame ourselves for situations. And I guess one of the questions that I had for you, you mentioned this situation where you were in the discussion circle and you were pushed out of the circle. I'm curious to know what happened. How did people respond? How did you or others in this discussion respond after that incident?
Yeah. I didn't do anything. And I think it's not because, these actions are so normalized, that they happen in subtle ways often. And it is really hard always to tell, is this a microaggression? And the answer is yes, probably. But it's hard to keep a tab on all of those things. Like I think also women, like white women, probably experience this too, along the lines of gender. Was someone overlooking my expertise? Was a man overlooking my expertise because of patriarchy? So no, I didn't address it. And sorry, what was the second part of that question?
Oh, how basically how did other people respond to that? Was it something
No, I think
that they noticed or recognized in some way?
No, it's so ubiquitous. It happens everywhere all the time. Like if you think of an example of imagine, here's a hypothetical scenario. Imagine a group of people, strangers, stuck in an elevator. Like the elevator sticks and they're, then somebody asks, what do we do? And imagine in that situation, just paying attention to where you look and to where other people look, like just with their eyes. And I can almost guarantee, and I offer this to everyone listening as an exercise, just to notice in yourself. I guarantee that people are probably not looking at a brown woman. They're not expecting the brown woman, who may or may not be an engineer, to say, yeah, everyone, this is how we're going to get out of the elevator, and so it's those things. And I actually think this is really fruitful, just for us to, without reacting, without blaming ourselves, to just slow down and notice in those moments, who do we look to instinctively as people we want to ask directions from, that we feel are good to talk to, that we think belong in a circle. And I think we can learn a lot. I do this all the time. I'm learning unsavory things about myself all the time and trying to hold those with love and to ask myself why. But right now, in these discussions, and I'm really happy to talk about myself because I can speak about myself with authority, and it gives you, the listener, a sense of where I'm coming from and whether or not you trust where my thoughts are coming from. I think that's important. I think you should do that with anybody who you're listening to. But I also want to signal that we're talking now about what's happening already once people are there in an organization that is probably not led by people of color. And I am really interested. So yes, I have a lot of experiences of racism, but where my mind is kind of going now is to back up so far and to ask what are the historical conditions that got us here? So right now where my mind is going is what does it mean to be living on Indigenous land if we are settlers, if there are Indigenous people listening, especially Ho-Chunk people listening, how you got here. but I think to engage collectively with those histories, and then this land generally in North America, especially in the States, was taken from Indigenous people, and then Black bodies were used as slave labor to work this land. And this is what has, if you go back far enough, this is what has, what a lot of these institutions are built on. We can't help it. So what does it look like to zoom out from, say, me getting pushed out of a circle and saying, whoa, what are the broader foundations, and how do we take responsibility for those? I also have a history of getting here, and it does have to do with colonialism, though not settler colonialism. And I'm happy to talk about that, but that's neither here nor there.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, what you're saying brings to mind, like, just this idea of pausing and noticing and really listening. And so I think that's a great segue into our next excerpt, in which you're exploring this process of listening, not only through our ears, but through our eyes.
I know that all of this sounds so far away from music itself. So I want to tie this together through considering the practice of listening, which is so key to the practice of making music. It is the practice of making music. And I want to emphasize that listening is not just an oral practice. Many musicologists, including Nina Eidsheim, argue that listening is a multisensorial practice. We're not just listening objectively. And I will include music teachers in this. I will include myself in this. We are also listening through our eyes and through our assumptions. Grace Wong, the scholar who I mentioned earlier, cites a study in which 88 music teachers were shown videotapes of trumpet and flute students and asked to evaluate their performances. So the videos were synced to identical trumpet and flute performances, like the sound was identical. But the changing variables were the people that these recordings were synced to. The variables were instrument, gender, race, and race was just white and black. And the music teachers, professional listeners, scored the performance of women lower than men, trumpeters lower than female trumpeters lower than female flautists, and black performers lower than white performers. So these things, these listening practices are shaped by many, many things being woven together. So part of the argument that I'm making for us, broadly conceived, to really sit with our thoughts and feelings about racialization in Western classical music does something, I would argue, to our listening practices, to the very tools that we use to make music. Okay, so now that we've moved into the realm of thinking about how practices of racialization affect our actual musical tools, I would like to speak a little bit about voice specifically and racialization. And that is because I would like to share with you an example that will make this more concrete. And it's an example that I can speak about with a lot of confidence because it's from my own life. And afterwards, I would like to share with you a practice that I am actively asking my students to do nowadays. So in popular discourse, the word voice is associated with other concepts that you might be familiar with: authenticity, naturalness, the idea that voices are an essence that somehow represents the singer, uniqueness. You know, we hear these words, we literally hear these words when teachers ask for a, quote, natural sound, or tell students, don't artificially darken that sound. You know, and when I see advertisements for singing lessons, I read things like, quote, find your authentic voice, or discover your true singing voice, or even the voice is the muscle of the soul. And at the heart of this kind of rhetoric, voice is not seen as something that we learn as social creatures from people around us, even though we do learn it from people around us. But it is seen as something that is innate and essential. The language that we use around voices reveals that we think they're important and that they reflect our identities. This part sounds really wonderful. But if you think about that research, about how listening has to do with our eyes and our assumptions and not just our ears, you can see what kind of minefields might be awaiting us with this kind of ideology. And let me just say that so far, voice scientists haven't found any difference, like racial differences among voices. What we think of as, being able to like hear race often has to more do with culture, has to do with like languages that people speak, accents that people have, speaking like communities. Okay, so you have listeners who are hearing through their assumptions. You have a notion of voice that is extremely high stakes. Your voice represents who you are. It is a muscle of your soul. And then you have some ill-informed ideas of race. Say that East Asians are mechanical somehow, or that Black performers are like really natural. None of which is innate, really. This is a recipe for disaster. And this is not only hypothetical. So here's my story. I remember moving to Vancouver from Edmonton when I was 17. I had decided I was going to be a singer, and I called up one of the most famous voice teachers there to ask if I could take a lesson with him. Nadia, I told him my name was. On the agreed upon day, at the agreed upon time, I waited for him in a little waiting room area. At one point, a man opened one of the doors. So this was a waiting area that had many doors that opened out onto it. So he opened one of the doors. He looked around. I was the only one there. And he went back into his office. Some time passed, and then I realized that maybe he was looking for me, but couldn't identify me. I mustered the courage to knock on his door. He opened it, poked his head out, and stared at me, totally oblivious. Are you, and insert, the name of this teacher. I'm not going to out him. Yes. Still total bafflement. I'm Nadia. And I extended my hand. Oh, I thought you'd be blonde, he said. So I'm telling you this to give you a concrete example. And so that we can break down what's happening here. Obviously, this voice teacher had trouble pairing my body with the idea that I was going to walk into his studio to produce a Western classical sound. He was maybe also having difficulty with my Slavic sounding name, which is also Arabic, by the way. And his assumptions, I suspect, had to do with a racialized understanding of Western classical singing. Western classical singing goes with white bodies, the way smoke goes with fire. The point of that being, although I'm not sure I could articulate it at the time, but was I going to trust this person to listen to me and then to teach me how to sing?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My camera is for some reason not quite working, so we're just going to focus in on Nadia.
I needed more attention.
Yeah. And wow, this question that she leaves us with, can I trust this person to listen to me and then to teach me how to sing? I'm just kind of trying to let that settle in and thinking about my own sort of collective experiences as a woman in the arts. And I guess one of the questions that I have for you, Nadia, is what happened with this teacher? Introduced yourself to him. Did you go on to study with him? How did this play out?
Yeah. So again, 17-year-old me just didn't even think that it was that weird because I was so used to this kind of subtler versions of this. So he was a good technician in many ways. Like, I learned things from him in the lesson. I didn't feel a personal connection. And he decided, so I didn't even have to make that decision. Like, he already was completely full. So he actually recommended somebody, and I studied with her, and it was good. Like, I do think that sometimes qualities like empathy and deep listening do help. And then I had a voice teacher who was fine. Like, she was good. I learned from her. I wouldn't say she really, there were some of those things that happened, but it wasn't so blatant. But I will say, and this is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's important. I had a phenomenal teacher in my undergraduate studies, Marisa Gaitan, her name is. And she, while she did not fully understand my experience as a racialized person, she didn't claim to understand it, but she listened to me so carefully and with so much love. And this isn't we weren't even talking about race. She was teaching me singing. But that kind of attentiveness, where you're not assuming that you share things with somebody, you're not assuming a common ground, but you're listening across difference while honoring that difference, makes a huge, it's hugely important. And she's an example of someone who did that really, really well.
Yeah, and it's the thing that I'm thinking about right now too is how singers, being that you are your instrument, you are in a lot of ways even more subject to people's assumptions and what people see. And in my background as an orchestral musician, I am truly grateful that we now have, blind auditions as a pretty strong standard in professional organizations, that's allowed women and people of color to increase their chances of winning a spot. I'd like to come a little bit now more like full circle with some of the questions we started with. Where are you from? And maybe like, where are we going? And this idea of our like personal history and this kind of grand zooming out history, like as you brought up.
Yeah, I love that you also asked, where are we going? I think that's a really nice compliment to the where are you from question. So, I mean, the way in which I've always, I have been asked, where are you from? It has felt like, I think, a hostile question to me, actually. It has meant, why are you a brown person singing Western classical music? Or, that question has been asked to me, where another more appropriate question would have been like, I don't know, what does that German text mean that you just sang? You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. And so I've become really interested, and this isn't my idea. A friend, Yuka Polovina, brought up the idea of, what would it mean for that question actually to feel good and to be an invitation to share of oneself. And so from myself, and I want to be really specific here, that sort of invitation of sharing of oneself, I'm thinking here specifically of people of color, because the where are you from question has traditionally been mobilized against people of color to sort of say you don't belong, or like, tell me things that you might not want to share. But I think that the way that everyone can take up that question, including white people, is thinking about that question in a broader way. So the way that people want to hear, that like, if you go far enough back, my family's from India, like, where is your family from? And how did you arrive in Wisconsin? And what are the broader forces that might have brought you here? That's what I would encourage, especially white people, to think about. And the reason that I say especially white people is that often people of color have thought about it because they have been asked their whole lives, where are you from? No, where are you really from? No, how did you get, like, why are you singing Western classical music? But I think answering that part of the question is really important, and maybe looking at things like, things to do with wealth to some extent. Like, one of the things that has allowed me to sing Western classical music is growing up middle class, and like my parents being able to afford music lessons for me, right? So that's one of them. But I think that the personal narrative is also really important. And what does it mean to tell a story that involves your own agency and will, that is perhaps about your growing love of Western classical music, and like kind of the personal journey that like brought you to this, but also what are the material and historical forces. And I think that's something that gets overlooked a lot in Western classical music, because our stories, our mythologies are so hero based. They're so like, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps, I am a genius, like Beethoven. I mean, like, maybe you don't. Okay, maybe you're not going to tell your story that way. But our kind of heroes, there is this idea of like the self-made individual. And I wonder what it would look like to not just say, oh, I got super lucky and this very famous person gave me an opportunity. Maybe there's something in there to acknowledge that perhaps there are some shared histories that this famous person got interested in your singing instead of why you're South Asian or something like that, So what does it mean to tell the story with both parts, the structural part and the personal part, and really think about how they intertwine?
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nadia. This was an amazing discussion, and I know there are tons more questions and things we could talk about. And if we didn't get to your questions, please, we've got them in the chat, and you can include them on the YouTube video. I highly encourage you to watch the full version of Nadia's lecture on the LunART YouTube channel, because we just didn't have time for it. There's such a wealth of information we could discuss. And I want to invite you to join us on Friday, September 25th at noon for our next LunART Live, which is the last Friday of every month. And on the 25th, we'll have Midori Sampson as our guest. Midori is a bassoonist with the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra and a lecturer at UW Stevens Point, and the co-founder of Tradewinds. And beyond that, I want to just encourage you to check out our website, stay engaged with us, stay tuned for a big announcement regarding our fall programming. You can check us out, obviously, on Facebook, Instagram, and become a subscriber to our email list to get all the nitty-gritty details. So I want to thank you all, and especially to Nadia, for joining us today. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone, so much. Thank you, LunART. Thank you, Marie.